Believe it or not, it's May, and that's beautiful and exciting. It is May, and we are starting a new worship series this month that is called Faces of Our Faith, in which we are going to be looking at some of the bold and untold stories of the Bible. Some of these stories are stories of people that we often overlook as minor players in the major Bible stories. We are in a season right now of big stories. Holy Week and Easter, these stories are big stories that we revisit every year. They're familiar. We know them by heart. They have and they continue to shape our faith. But have we really considered all of the people in these stories, even those who play a little role in the big story? Often overlooked in the big arc of the story are these individuals who each have their own unique story to tell, a story of faith, a story that helps us to better understand our own relationship with God and how God is at work in the lives of ordinary people just like us. For the next few weeks, we are going to be looking at faces of people in the stories of Holy Week and Easter that don't get top billing in the big picture. This week, our focus is on Joseph of Arimathea. Do you remember who he is? The short answer to this question is, of course, that Joseph of Arimathea was the wealthy man who went to Pontius Pilate after Jesus was crucified and asked for permission to take his body for burial. Then he took the body to a tomb that he had hewn in a rock and buried Jesus. This is a pretty big deal. But in the big scheme of the really big resurrection story, we often read right past the contributions of Joseph. Joseph of Arimathea is mentioned in all 4 gospel accounts of the burial of Jesus. You've probably heard his name every year, and yet have you really thought very much about him? The efforts of Joseph of Arimathea are even referenced in the Apostles' Creed, was crucified, died, and was buried, and then rose again on the 3rd day. The burying part is not the part that we typically spend a lot of time focusing on. But the burial is often overlooked because it's kind of this transition time between the despair of crucifixion and the promise and joy of resurrection. But what happens in between is important too. And Joseph of Arimathea is a complex and interesting character. While mentioned in all 4 gospel accounts, what is mentioned specifically about him varies from account to account, and this leaves us with clues as well as questions as to who this man was. Both Mark and Luke mention his name and say that he was a member of the council and a good and righteous man who looked for the kingdom. Our passage from Luke today says that Joseph was a good and righteous man who, though a member of the council, had not agreed to their plan and action. The council that we're talking about here is the Sanhedrin, the high Jewish council, the very ones who condemned Jesus to death. Joseph didn't agree with them, but also apparently didn't or couldn't stop them from their actions, which resulted in the crucifixion of Jesus. Matthew doesn't mention the council, but that Joseph was a rich man, a disciple of Jesus. The Gospel of John calls Joseph a disciple of Jesus, but a secret one, due to his fear of Jewish authorities. While the Synoptic Gospels have the women as the ones who were after the crucifixion came to the tomb to prepare the body with spices, in the Gospel of John it was Joseph along with Nicodemus who carefully prepared Jesus' body for a burial that was fit for a king. These 2 wealthy and important men in the Gospel of John provided a new tomb in a garden, myrrh and expensive spices. What a dramatic transformation as Nicodemus, the one who came to Jesus at night, And Joseph, the one who was the secret disciple, boldly caring for the body of the man that their colleagues had convicted as a dangerous criminal. In the gospel account of the burial and the discovery of the empty tomb, it is made clear that those caring for the body of Jesus after his death were careful to observe the Sabbath laws. They were devout Jews. The story of crucifixion and burial provides for us examples both of Jewish resistance to, but also Jewish acceptance of Jesus. In this story, the story of Joseph of Arimathea has a timely, important message for us today. The fact that Joseph was part of the council that had condemned Jesus and also a disciple of Jesus clues us in to the understanding that any kind of anti-Semitic interpretation of the Jews in general killing Jesus is not accurate. And this is a really important thing for us to realize and remember. Just last week, a young man, a member and a regular attender of a Christian church, entered a synagogue in San Diego and killed a woman and injured 3 others, and was intent on doing more harm if not for a gun malfunction. Just before this violent attack, this young man allegedly posted a 7-page letter which he spelled out his core beliefs. And among those beliefs, he mentioned that he believed that Jewish people were guilty of many things, most importantly, the killing of Jesus, and that for this they deserved to die. His intention was to kill Jewish people to glorify God. Please hear this message today. While fearful and power-hungry religious leaders called for the crucifixion of Jesus, this is not something that we can place blame on Jewish people in general. Fear and power corrupt people to do awful things. They did then, and they still do now. But hear this story today. Jesus and his disciples were Jewish. Even people on the council did not agree with or support the condemnation of Jesus. Keep in mind that Jesus was a reformer. He was a strong critic of the corruption he saw in the temple practices and the leadership of the high priests. To be a follower of Jesus was to stand in opposition to the corrupt temple leadership and also to Roman imperial domination. And as we know from the story of Jesus, this is a very dangerous place to stand. We don't know how vocal Joseph was with his dissent. Did he speak out against those who wanted to crucify Jesus, offering a different perspective? Or was he, as John said, a secret disciple, keeping to himself his convictions that were making Jesus a target of the council? What a difficult place for a believer in Jesus to be. Can you even imagine? Have you ever been in a situation where you think things are going in a direction that are unjust or wrong, but you were too afraid to speak up in defense of what you believe to be right? Have you ever been afraid to speak up, letting things little by little escalate until it seems too late to stop the momentum? While not supporting crucifixion, I think that we can find ourselves in these ethical situations at times in our lives too. Whether at work or in our communities, have you ever found yourself identifying injustice, but then being afraid to speak up because you didn't want to become the target of attack? We think of peer pressure as kind of a teenage thing, but while it takes a different, more nuanced form, adults are just as susceptible to this kind of group dynamic. Have you ever thought that something was wrong, but were afraid to speak up? Or maybe you were brave enough to speak to a group of like-minded friends, but you were never brave enough to speak out in the face of injustice directly. Joseph knew what was to come for Jesus. He was privy to the workings of this council, and yet he was also awaiting the kingdom of God that Jesus proclaimed, just like the disciples. Can you even imagine what he must have been feeling in the process of the trial and the suffering and the crucifixion of Jesus? As the council convinced the crowd to release Barabbas, a brutal criminal, while crucifying an innocent, peaceful man whose ideas and teachings only threatened the power of the empire and the religious authorities? Can you even feel the pit in his stomach, the sadness or even guilt as he watched an innocent man that he believed in, agreed with, followed, put to death by his colleagues? Can you imagine his questions? Did I do enough? What more could I have done to stop this? How could I have let this happen? The time of the crucifixion of Jesus and the time following was a scary time for the disciples. The women stayed close to Jesus throughout the crucifixion and the burial, but the other disciples scattered. Perhaps the women may have felt a bit safer. They were less likely to be viewed as posing a threat of revolution that made Jesus and his followers the target of Roman officials. But the disciples scattered in fear. Joseph of Arimathea was living in one community with a secret identity. He was a follower of Jesus. Have you ever considered what Joseph risked to speak up and take the body of Jesus? Crucifixion was an execution that was used to send a message, and it was reserved only for the worst of criminals, those who were threats to the empire. It was used to deter others who might think that they wanted to revolt against the empire, people who were criminally or politically dangerous. The crucified bodies were not typically afforded a burial. They weren't treated with respect. They were often just left out in the open for scavenger birds and beasts to consume, or they perhaps were just tossed away, discarded in a common grave. Nothing would deter would-be dissenters like the body of a political enemy of Rome being devoured by wild beasts. Crucifixion is brutal business. And the Roman Empire used brutality and fear to maintain control. So then, Joseph, this member of the council who had condemned Jesus to death, went to Pilate and asked for permission to bury the body. We should not underestimate how bold this act was. How often we overlook this act of bravery. What did Joseph risk to do this act? In asking Pilate for Jesus' body, Joseph moved from being a timid, secret supporter of Jesus to being bold enough to take action. Asking Pilate for the body was publicly proclaiming himself a disciple. He was publicly proclaiming himself a disciple, and all the while, the 11 disciples closest to Jesus were hiding in fear. What consequences did he risk? Rejection from his colleagues? Being ostracized from the community? Losing his place of prominence in the community? Or worse, being a target, being the next target of this violence? Jesus was a Jew. The council had proven capable of turning on their own. But oh, how God works in mysterious ways. Joseph didn't know how important his acts would be in the story of resurrection. Joseph may have asked for the body as a way of being faithful, perhaps fearful that it was too little, too late, but faithful nonetheless. He had no idea the difference he was making, the role he was playing in the story that appeared to be over for all of the followers of Jesus, but instead was still unfolding in dramatic ways that none of Jesus' followers seemed to predict. I wonder, did Joseph think that the tomb was the end of the story? Did he think that when he closed the tomb with the stone that he was closing a chapter in a tragic story of hope that would never be? What a pivotal role Joseph played in the Easter story. It would have been hard to look for the body and have this dramatic, the body is missing experience of Easter morning if the body had just been left for scavengers. Instead, the stone was rolled away from the tomb that Joseph had provided. The empty tomb was a compelling sign that something miraculous had happened. Joseph's story shows us how God can use human action as part of divine purpose. In his role in the burial of Jesus, God used Joseph's actions in important ways in the resurrection story. And God can use us too, our actions and our stories as part of God's divine purpose as well. Even when fear threatens to keep us silent and doesn't allow us to have the courage to act out boldly in the face of every injustice, we, like Joseph, can be stretched to greater faithfulness by the mystery of God. Our faith, if we allow it, can stretch us into boldness and confidence that we never knew we possessed. During Jesus' ministry, did Joseph sympathize with Jesus from a distance, but kind of chicken out when he was confronted with an opportunity up close? And then this makes me wonder, do we agree with Jesus only from a safe distance and not when it actually involves risk for us personally? When we agree with Jesus, we agree with the last becoming first. We align ourselves not with those who are in power, but with the powerless. We use our power in whatever form that may be to elevate those at the bottom, to heal those who are sick, and to love those deemed unlovable by society. Joseph's story gives us clues and leaves us with questions. Joseph was not part of Jesus' inner circle. He was not a big part of the story before the burial or after the burial. So why? Why did he risk what he did to do his part in the Easter story? And then where were those in the inner circle? Had fear, shock, disappointment, and grief kept them away? This causes me to wonder, what things keep us away from Jesus? What things keep us from blessing the poor and the powerless, from advocating for justice for the least and the lost? What keeps us from loving those that we are told by others are unlovable? Like the disciples, I think it's probably a mix of motivations. We don't always have clear motives. And yet the story of Joseph shows us that we shouldn't count anybody out. Who would have thought that a member of the council that had condemned Jesus would have been the one to care for Jesus' body, providing a tomb worthy of the burial of a king? Bold faith comes even from unexpected places. The story of Joseph of Arimathea is a powerful story, of finding courage to boldly act, even after perhaps we question ourselves as to if we did enough in the